Hello everyone, this is Sam Droege with the National Bee Lab. I'm with Eric Hernandez, who's our videographer, and John Sauer, who's a statistician with U.S. Geological Survey. And we're going to talk today about a series of long-term bird monitoring programs that have some counterparts or possibilities or things that we can learn from their 50-plus years of running these surveys that might inform how a national pollinator strategy might go. So what I want to do first is allow John to introduce himself in a little better way and also talk about his background, and then we'll move into the breeding bird survey.
Okay, so I'm John Sauer, and I work at the Eastern Environmental Science Center, formerly the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, and I've spent pretty much my whole career here working on bird surveys. So I've worked on all the surveys we're going to talk about today, and we'll talk a bit about how they're adaptable to other taxa. One interesting thing that's worth mentioning at the start and keeping in mind throughout is that over the years there's kind of been a shift amongst the monitoring people and thinking about really rigorous designs with sample units and very careful consideration of all the components of design, shifting more to things that are more big sciencey, where you go out and just collect a lot of data and throw it into a system and do a complex computer algorithm to extract pattern. And there's a little bit of controversy there, although you'll see that with eBird, one of the projects we'll talk about, the big data approach seems to work pretty darn well.
Okay, John, tell us about the breeding bird survey. Give us an idea of geographic scope, methodology, and analysis, and particularly then focus on what's not surveyed and what's surveyed well, and if you have anything about costs and benefits, that would be good too.
Okay, so the North American Breeding Bird Survey was started in 1966 by Jan Robbins, who had been doing roadside surveys for snipes and other things across the continental U.S. and southern Canada. And that's basically the scope of the Breeding Bird Survey. It's the contiguous United States, Alaska, and the roaded parts of Canada, because the Breeding Bird Survey is a breeding season roadside survey of birds. So people go out and drive a 24.5-mile route along secondary or tertiary roads, and every half mile they get out and they do a 3-minute point count where they record all birds heard and seen within a certain distance of the point, and they record it and they jump in their car and go to the next stop. And it's usually done in from late April to mid-July, depending on where you are latitudinally, to keep up with bird phenology. And it's been going on since 1966, and right at the moment it's the primary source of information on bird population change for about 526 species of birds.
Are those permanent routes, and how were the routes laid out, and what's the sampling frame look like? Do people go wherever they want?
Yeah, so it's kind of a quasi-systematic design where they pre-decide where these routes are going to start and give a notion of the route path, and then the observer, the first time they go, will establish 50 counting locations along the BBS route, and they try diligently to do those same spots year after year. And we also try to have consistency in having the same observer do the routes.
And talk about sampling density across the United States and Canada.
So it varies regionally, as with most of the surveys we'll talk about, where there's lots of people. These surveys are mostly run by volunteers, so more people, more sample units. And that's a problem. It's a good thing to have more data, but it's also a problem if you have some areas with a lot of data and some areas with a little, because you have to attempt to accommodate that in the analysis by stratifying. So usually the unit that they lay these BBS routes out in is degree blocks. So in the eastern U.S. there'll be, I don't know, at least 3 or more roots per degree block, but if you go out into the west, you're lucky if you get 1. So as you go out into places where there aren't many people, like central Canada, you get very sparse data, and that's one of those concerns that we're always worrying about. And in fact, the breeding bird survey started as a local thing in the eastern U.S. and expanded to the continent by 1968, but it's really been expanding ever since. So trying to figure out how to control for the increasing number of roots and increasing observer enthusiasm is something we spend a lot of time in the analysis controlling for and worrying about.
So what are the main biasing factors with the current system, and also what percentage of the breeding bird fauna are covered in terms of giving you what you might consider something close to good understanding of how their trajectories are across, say 20 plus years?
So the trick in the breeding bird survey is to have this ongoing consideration of what things might be changing over the longer and longer time periods we have data for, and trying to control for it. For example, it seems like phenology is changing. Birds are getting more active earlier, so their visibility might be changing. So we've been recently doing a big project to try to control for visibility aspects. But the notion is, though, that you have to standardize as best you can to find areas where the populations are consistent and sample in those periods, and then try to control for aspects that you can't hold together by standardization. But of course it's an omnibus survey, so many species are surveyed, and some of them are really surveyed well. A lot of the ones we're hearing right now, red-eyed vireos and other things, are well surveyed, but other species that are not seen along roads are very poorly surveyed. Now, we use the data. Sam and I wrote a paper on wood duck, and Chan Robbins made the comment, you only see a wood duck like 1 every 4 years along BBS routes, and it's a good cautionary note. But we do get data for species like that, but we tend to be more cautious in interpretation.
So so a lot of the breeding birds are covered in some ways. The difficulty is that when you want to start looking at smaller and smaller regions, it's sort of like comparing the Pacific Northwest to the northeastern states for a species that covers the same area, or look within a state. A lot of times, a lot of species drop out. So you might have good coverage at a continental level, but you're not really able to speak in a lot of detail sometimes about some of these subsections.
Yes, and there's ongoing controversy about whether the BBS does a good job of monitoring since it's just along roadsides. So there are major projects in the central part of the U.S. where they sample off roads and try to integrate that in with breeding bird survey data.
So there's a lot more that we could talk about here, but I think that's good. So, and we're running out of time, obviously. So let's talk about Christmas bird counts, which is the longer term data set, but run in a very different way, and how the way it's run impacts the usefulness of the resulting data.
Yeah, so the Christmas bird count was started probably around 1900, but it was never really thought of as being a monitoring program until fairly recently. And it, as you might expect, it's a winter survey, so it occurs within 2 weeks of Christmas. And the sample units for the Christmas bird counts are 15-mile diameter circle centered on a point that they use to sort of designate the circle. And they have a coordinator for the circle and a bunch of volunteers that vary widely in quality going out and counting on one day. And they get together, it's a big social event, and put the data all into a reasonable format and submit it to the National Audubon Society, who manages it. It started out, even more so than the BBS, as something that they put down these circles where there were people. So if you look at a map of Christmas bird count circles, you see a lot of them are along coastal eastern U.S. And a lot of the data from the interior U.S. is more recent. And that complicates the analysis.
They're maximizing their species list, basically, completely observer chosen.
Yeah.
in terms of locations.
And also some circles only have a couple people, and some circles have hundreds of people. So there's a lot of variation in effort. And we spent a lot of time a few years ago figuring out ways of analyzing Christmas bird count data, and it seems essential to in some way control for effort in analyzing Christmas bird count data. So we have ways of modeling that simultaneously with population change. And we should mention we have a companion PowerPoint that points you to some references for doing these things, and also provides explicit details with probably correct information, which I'll occasionally give variations on here.
All right, so I think that's good. Let's roll from that. And Christmas bird counts are used, but mostly as secondary information because of all the issues associated with the questions about how the survey was set up. So if there's a big change, you can see it in Christmas count. The nuance is probably not something that's particularly useful as an early warning system, for example.
And two quick comments. One is that there's that issue that we try to control for the fact that there's lots of circles in some places and very little data in others. Circles, by the way, are the sample unit, if I didn't say that explicitly. Yeah, so that's a big point. And the other thing is that bird populations are fluctuating at that time of winter. So we see changes in how birds are distributed over time. So you see a very strong signal of changes in wintering distributions of birds. And that kind of makes you wonder, so how much of this is just bird distributions changing, and how much of it is real population change?
You want variation, you should do bug surveys.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's one of our problems. So let's move into eBird. So explain eBird, and then give some ideas about how it is useful and not useful, and how it has little pockets within it that allow repeated surveys, or actually very nicely designed surveys, to occur amidst a field of random data sometimes.
So there were a series of checklist programs, back at the end of the 20th century, where people were encouraging observers to go out and submit their checklists of bird counts to state biologists, who would then make maps of distribution and use those to monitor population change. And I believe eBird came out of that. And the genius of eBird is that it's designed to be a way for people to submit their own data and curate it, keep track of what they've seen, and look at how it relates to other people's data. So there's a lot of added value for bird watchers in eBird, and they get a lot of feedback. So it encourages people to participate, but also they enter their data into this big computer system that the people at Cornell have done a fantastic job of analyzing, and they've reached this critical mass of observers out there. So they have lots of data to work with, and they've developed sophisticated big data models, like STEM models is what they're called. And if you go to their website, you can see really impressive maps of population distribution and change through the year.
Yeah, so they have millions of records and thousands of observers, and people keep track of basically everything, but they do allow people to put in atlas data and some of these other data sets within there and keep them separate. So you can create a monitoring program if you want is more quantified.
And that's a real important point, because we want we often want specific projects in specific areas. For example, if we wanted to monitor birds at Patuxent here, we have a way of doing it. We would go out to points throughout the refuge and do counts. You could actually enter those data into eBird and use the structure that we define in the system here for a monitoring program in the context of the very general data that they have. So they like the idea that people will define structure and count at specific locations at specific times. For example, they love the idea that there's the breeding bird survey data out here that has all this spatially explicit information on bird locations. That really helps their inference as well.
Right.
So yeah, so the genius of eBird is that it um, has the capability to allow you to think about designing experiments in this very general framework of entering data.
So let's roll finally into the last big bird survey type of program that's occurring, and talk about atlases, primarily breeding bird atlases. So if you want to give a little overview and then talk about how things can be done within that.
So breeding bird atlases were kind of state-specific and province-specific citizen science activities where state bird organizations would divide the state up into equally sized blocks, like 1/6 of a topo map, for example, would be a block. And they would assign people to go out and count in these areas. And sometimes they'd even do more formal point counts within those areas to get counts of birds. And they would also keep track of breeding status of the birds, and then make maps of breeding status by these blocks across the state. And Chan Robbins kind of brought this idea back from Europe in the 60s, and many states have done a couple of atlases in the past 20 years, and they're looking at change over time. So it's spatially explicit. You have these little pixels across the state that you get information on bird species distribution and abundance, and change over time. So that, Atlas is nice, and you can see the obvious connections to eBird, because you could use eBird to collect data for an atlas very easily. And it also makes you think that you could apply that same general model at different geographic scales. For example, you could divide this refuge up into blocks and do a little mini atlas here.
Right.
And it also connects to statistical methods like occupancy methods, which have a lot of appeal for those kind of data sets.
How do you control for effort? And I guess how have people not controlled for effort in the past, and what kind of problems does that bring up, and what's sort of the current thinking on it?
It's always an issue, and usually people make a conscious effort to not let the number of observers vary much between blocks. So they'll go out and they'll attempt to have more people do surveys, or go out and do counts in areas with less data. So it's often done in an ad hoc way. But also people do systematic surveys within blocks so that they have a consistent data set that's distinct from sort of the general observations that they can compare among blocks.
They're basically doing, say, a checklist with keeping track of time, and then they add on top of that random observations, like, oh, I saw a bald eagle fly over this block when I was driving to work, kind of thing, which falls outside the standardized portion of it. So any atlas can do that. In the past, they were relatively poor about separating those features, so you had someone who lived inside a block, and their lists were huge because they could accumulate pretty much an infinite list of birds. And then you had other blocks that were visited only a couple of times because they were so remote, and they were all pulled together and compared over across a couple time periods. Each time period there's always more and more effort, so to some extent you're biased by the amount of participation and over years to see more species, see more records.
So one critical point to make in our limited remaining time is that atlases are kind of old-fashioned in a way. However, the modern ones, the recent ones, integrate more and more information. They include both what we were just talking about as traditional atlas, but they also include standard information from breeding bird survey, and more they're including information from eBird. So it's worth taking a look at some recent breeding bird atlases just so you can see how people handle the integrated nature of a couple different data sets in coming up with species accounts.
So in the couple minutes we have left, what groups of birds are not really accommodated by the 4 surveys that we saw? I mean, are there ones that need specialized surveys, or what's the overall pattern? How much do we have?
20 seconds.
2 minutes.
No, 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
I mean, all of them give information on a wide variety of species, and sometimes it's hard to tell when the limited amount of information is of no use at all. Oftentimes some surveys will go out and specifically try to get information, so on taxa that aren't well surveyed by other groups.
Right,
For
they do.
example, the atlases will have people go out and do blockbusting, where they'll specifically go for nocturnal birds. And so there's a lot of specific efforts for poorly sampled taxa, but obviously eBird is the most generic of all of them and probably has the widest scope of species, but also the least control over how the data are collected.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time, but thank you, John. Thank you, Eric. And we'll call that a wrap.